All right, so I just want to welcome everyone. Thank you for all being here. This is the community information meeting about the proposed budget for the 2022-2023 school year. My name is Krista Siringo, and I am a Bristol representative to the school board, and I'm also the chair of the Community Engagement Committee. And we have been working to ensure that our community has the opportunity to hear about all the different things happening on the school board front. And so this is one of the events that we are coordinating. So it's hard to believe, at least for me and probably for you as well, that we are about at the midway point of this academic year, which is the third one that's been impacted by the COVID pandemic. And I just want to take a moment before we start on behalf of the school board to just say thank you. A very big thank you to all of our teachers and staff and administrators for continuing to show up and do this work that's always hard, but in some really incredibly challenging times. I also want to show appreciation for the families and students who are still hanging in there, because we know it hasn't been easy for anybody. And I think we're all hoping beyond hope that this budget we're talking about tonight is going to be spent on a school year not overshadowed by a pandemic and all of the stressors that come with it. So it's with great optimism that we present this to you this evening. So the school board has been hearing from Superintendent Reen since October about the assumptions, budget drivers, and projections that are a part of the planning for the next school year. We've had the chance to ask a lot of questions, and those have been captured along with the answers in the resource document that was shared along with this agenda. And that document has actually been updated since our last meeting, and it is now posted on the MAUSD website in the school board section on the Community Engagement Committee page. And I'll share that link at the end of the meeting. Tonight is your opportunity as community members to ask your questions. So the way this is going to work is that we'll take the first part of the meeting to hear a presentation by Superintendent Reen, and then we'll move on to Q&A. You can submit your questions at any time during the presentation, and we'll be compiling them, and then they'll be asked as soon as the presentation is done. If we aren't able to get to your question, it will be captured after the meeting in that FAQ that I mentioned earlier. And those will also be added to these meeting minutes. The school board is the next step for the school board is to have an additional meeting where we will discuss the budget and finalize the warning for that budget to be placed on the town meeting ballot. And we are trying to nail down the date for that. We requested an additional meeting to have that conversation. Right now, we're looking at the 20th or the 21st of January, but we should know by tomorrow, the end of the week, exactly when that meeting is going to be, and we will send out information as soon as we have it. So thank you again for joining us, and I'm going to turn the meeting over to Superintendent Reen.
All right, good evening, everyone. So the way the format of this presentation is going to work tonight will be kind of a walkthrough of the budget presentation that I've given to the board in that same format, showing some of the sort of facts and figures surrounding that. And then it's going to sort of transition into a reflection on the feedback that was gathered through the thought exchange around the budget. And I'll speak to some of the themes that emerged from that thought exchange data and talk about where those themes are reflected, if they're reflected in this budget. Following that portion is when we'll shift into the Q&A, and we have folks behind the scenes that will be helping with the Q&A. So without further ado, I'll share my screen and we can start walking through the presentation. All right, Floyd, can you just confirm for me with a thumbs up that you're seeing the MAUSD budget presentation? Okay, thanks. All right. So it's usually helpful to start thinking about the budget within the context of where we are now and a little bit about where we're going in terms of some demographic information. So that's where we'll start. And what we see here on this slide is some historical data in terms of enrollment by school, and then of course for the district at the end, and projecting out only to next year. We have projections that go beyond, but really looking at FY23 for the budget tonight is sort of the focus on how far out we projected. And so what I think you'll see is overall a decline in enrolled students. This is not news to us. This is a trend that we've been seeing for quite some time. And this is part of what's creating some of the financial hardships that we're trying to find a path forward through. What I'll highlight, I kind of highlight some of the trends school by school in the next slide. Actually on the slide after this. What you can see here is average class sizes. So looking at that enrollment, kind of how it materializes in the schools really is around this concept of class size. And so looking at the younger grades in the elementary schools and the older grades in the elementary schools, class sizes at the high school vary quite a bit more. And that has to do with course offerings, our effort to keep a broad array of course offerings while we manage the student population, which again is on the decline. This page is really focusing on those K2 and 3-6 class sizes, which you can see there's some consistency across schools in the current year, the outlier being Lincoln's class size. Some of this is a result of a pretty sharp decline in enrollment at Lincoln in recent years. And to keep staffing at the same pace of the sharp decline that Lincoln has had would have been a very dramatic decline in staffing. So it's been a little bit more gradual of an adjustment at the staffing level than what we saw in actuality with enrollment. But what you can see is going forward to next year, Lincoln's class size comes more into check with the other schools. And that's in part due to a reduction in one classroom teaching position at Lincoln for next year, in addition to 0.1 reduction in a building principal at Lincoln next year. And that really brings Lincoln staffing levels into check with Beeman, who will have about the same student population next year. And so this is the class size guidelines that we use to sort of make decisions around those kinds of staffing levels. And I think what you'll see is that this previous slide shows that we are within the class size guidelines, given the adjustments that we're looking to make for next year. So this is the summary I was referring to earlier. And this is really only going back to FY18 and projecting out to what we anticipate for next school year. And in that time, you can see the breakdown for the district, but also school by school. And so this kind of gives you a sense of what has been experienced in recent years at each school, showing Beeman down about 13%, Bristol staying flat, Lincoln, as I mentioned, with a pretty sharp decline of 41% of its students in that time frame, Moncton at 13, Robinson at 29, and Mount Abe down about 2%. For those that have been sort of following closely, looking at the NASDAQ projections, et cetera, this reflects what NASDAQ has shown, and the projection going forward is that Mount Abe is going to start to see a sharper decline in their enrollment, which makes sense that the sharp decline that we've been seeing in the elementary school is going to work its way through Mount Abe at the 7-12 level. And so that has an impact on us in terms of funding, because from that weighting formula, secondary students, so 7-12 students, are weighted more heavily. So when we lose at a greater rate at the secondary level, our equalized pupil drops even faster. So we're going to experience that crunch as these kids move through 7-12. This is looking a little bit more specifically at the equalized pupil count. So again, just to sort of bring everybody to the same page on what that term is, enrollment is the number of heads that are sort of in schools, the number of kids that are enrolled in buildings. Equalized pupil is a formula that applies different weights to different students based on their needs. I mentioned before that the secondary students are weighted more heavily than elementary students. That's a part of the formula that produces the equalized pupil count. This equalized pupil number is really important for us because that is what our budget is built on. So in terms of tax rates, the cost per equalized pupil is the most direct relation to the tax rate. So paying attention to the equalized pupil is a really important component to looking at the budget. And you can see going back to 2017 and working through to projected next year, it's a pretty marked decline in our equalized pupil count. And that's based on, in part, our decline in enrollment. What is important to note for FY23 as we're looking at that budget, we're being credited for FY23 as having 1,439 equalized pupils, at least as of now. I think that there's still some room for that to change. It probably won't change dramatically, but it could change a little bit. We are benefiting from a hold harmless provision, which sort of recognizes that during these COVID years, enrollment has done some funny things with the number of kids enrolling in home study programs, et cetera. So school districts were held harmless for significant drops in enrollment. That's fortunate for us because without that hold harmless, our actual equalized pupil would be down closer to 14,000. And to put it in context, each equalized pupil represents almost $20,000 in our ability to spend without impacting the tax rate. So you start getting in the 20, 30, 40 student range, and it's a significant amount of money that ends up sort of meaning for us in terms of our ability to spend. We'll talk more about this as we get into some other slides. So if we put that in context, I mentioned the 20,000 per student, give or take. So FY23 is projected to have 95 fewer equalized pupils than FY18. When we multiply that out at that 19,868 per equalized pupil, that means that had equalized pupil remained flat, had enrollment stayed flat, needs were the same, basically had that remained stable over this period of time, MAUSD could spend almost $1.9 million more and have the same tax rate. So that's a pretty significant impact on a $30 million budget. I mentioned the hold harmless before. Had it not been for the hold harmless, without the hold harmless, we would have had 130 fewer equalized pupils, which would be a $2.5 million difference in what we could spend while keeping tax rates the same and the cost per pupil the same. So this drop in equalized pupils is quite significant, and it has a real monetary effect on our ability to spend while keeping the tax rate reasonable. It's always important as we're working through these numbers that we highlight assumptions that we're making, because the reality is at this point in the game, even though we're approaching the date by which the board has to adopt a budget in order to get it warned for town meeting, there are a lot of assumptions we still need to make in building that budget. And some of these assumptions won't be finalized until after the board has adopted the budget. It's a sort of an unfortunate quirk in the way the system works in Vermont. So there are assumptions identified here, and there are assumptions identified on individual slides as we go through, trying to really highlight really all of the assumptions that are built into this to try and be really transparent. So some assumptions that are here. So we chose not to fill positions that were vacated by attrition since the last budget was adopted. And that's a strategy we've been using for a while now. As someone leaves their position for a whole variety of reasons, could be retirement, they might move out of state, they might take a job in a different district, might move out of education altogether, whole range of different reasons why people choose to leave their job. Every time that happens in our district, in light of our financial crisis, we've been really looking at those positions critically to see if they need to be filled or not. Almost every year for the past 5 or 6 years, there have been positions that were vacated through attrition that we didn't fill. That's a much preferred approach to reducing staff than riffing or having to essentially fire people who wish to stay employed with us. So we really look critically at doing that. So we chose not to fill some positions coming into this budget, and we are not planning on filling those positions as we roll forward to next year. This does, as I mentioned before, reflect a 1.0 reduction in a classroom teacher at Lincoln and 0.1 admin at Lincoln, again, to reflect that enrollment decline. So we're still playing a little bit of catch up in the staffing there, as I showed on that class size slide. This does assume a 10% increase in the healthcare premiums. We feel like it's going to come in pretty close to that. So that feels like a pretty reasonable assumption. And again, this is assuming a reduction of 25.99 equalized pupils given the hold harmless, which again would have been 61. So the hold harmless is a significant benefit for us. That would have been much, much harder to produce a budget with a reasonable tax rate for next year had it not been for the hold harmless. Important to note that hold harmless will go away at some point. So this is all going to catch up to us, but not for FY23. Kind of pushes it down the road a little ways. We do have an FY21 fund balance that has been audited. It came in at that figure a little over $1.4 million. I have some notes in here about what the recommendation is to do with those dollars. This budget does not have a spending threshold that we have to pay attention to, as we have in years past. There's a moratorium on the spending threshold currently. It is expected that the spending threshold or some version of cost containment will return, but it's not in place for building FY23. We did get a couple of different yield projections from the state. And so the yield is basically the amount of money that it is expected $1 tax rate would generate for the education fund. And so that yield basically is what finalizes what the actual tax rate is for towns. We were given two. We're using the more conservative of the two yield projections. So when we get into the tax rates, our assumption is that the tax rates will be as good or better than what we're showing you, given that we're using the more conservative of the yield figures that were given to us. Tonight's budget for FY23 assumes there's no impact from the weighting study. It seems the weighting study will be a hot topic in the legislative session, this session for sure. Hard to know exactly what the decision around that weighting study will be, and therefore it's hard to know what the impact could be. The reality is the impact could be somewhere around $1 million to the bad for us, somewhere around $1 million to the good for us, or pretty much anywhere in between. So the range is pretty wide in terms of where that's going to land. This budget tonight that you're going to see shows no impact assumed for next year. If there is a decision made this legislative session, it seems highly unlikely, given that budgets will be adopted already, that whatever the impact is will start for FY23. It seems entirely likely that it would start post FY23. And lastly, another thing that's in the legislature right now is Act 173. It's currently slated to begin in FY23, and there's a lot of interest and advocacy around delaying that implementation. So tonight's budget does not show an impact from Act 173. That impact is anticipated to be relatively insignificant. So we'll see what happens with that, but just to be upfront in the assumptions, tonight's budget assumes there's no action on 173 next year. There were a series of questions that the board asked, and some I built into this budget this way, and others were answered in what is now in the FAQ doc on the website that Krista mentioned before. So some slides here you'll see are direct answers to those some of those questions posed by the board. So the board had set a 5% budget target early on, and we were able to hit that target. And in conversations with the board, it was recognized that additional positions were needed to provide support for students, in particular in the context of COVID-19. Some positions we can certainly fund through ESSER, and it was important to think about building some positions into the budget that we might see sustained post-ESSER as well. And so you'll see some slides where we are adding money beyond this 5% budget target that the board set, and we'll talk more about the impact there. But the question was, is the 5% sufficient? And the short answer was really that it depends, maybe not. And some of it depended on the use of the fund balance. We did, in talking with staff around ESSER needs and also principles around what they were seeing for needs. Some of the themes that emerged from that feedback or input was really around the need for more mental health supports, more safety support, and more oversight and support for student and family needs. And you can see some of the more specific thoughts within those categories on this slide. And so this is really what prompted my request for the board of the last meeting to add funds to the budget to help address some of these needs that were raised. My request at the last board meeting was 500,000, and that was met very well by the board. There was a great deal of support for adding that 500,000. In fact, a couple of members were wanting to know if that was enough, if perhaps more was needed. And so tonight, what you see for figures is actually 540,000, which that slight increase makes us feel more confident that we can be looking at targeting 6 professional positions to add to help meet some of these needs that are here. And I'll get into what some of those positions are anticipated to be. And so here you can see that 540,000 to help support 6 positions to address some of those needs. And again, this will be in addition to what we have for ESSER funds, but this really positions us to try and sustain some of these supports when those ESSER funds are no longer around shortly after the end of next school year. And this is also intended to help us really stretch some of those education reserve fund dollars, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute as well. So getting to that now. So I mentioned this $1.4 million fund balance. That is from last year. That is money that was unspent. There's a whole range of reasons why there was unspent money. I mentioned that we each year have not filled some positions that were budgeted for. That's a significant driving force that produces a fund balance like that. We had some expenses that were offset by funds that came in around COVID. So there are some offset expenses there. And then on top of that, we generally have, a 1 to 2% fund balance anyway, which in a $30 million budget puts you in the $300,000 to $600,000 balance. So all those things combined, we have about $1.4 million in a fund balance that we have to make some decisions about what to do. The recommendation that we're making is that $870,000 of that goes into the capital reserve fund. We've targeted some needed improvements in facilities, in particular MAUSD. Those improvements, we're in the process right now of a lobby upgrade and bathroom upgrade. So that will provide increased safety, but also just a better up-to-date experience using those facilities. Thinking about the lobby as the sort of heart of the building and the community access, that it'll provide sort of a more professional, respectful experience that really reflects the work that happens there, and hopefully builds pride in our community for the facility and everything that's going on there. Beyond that, the safety upgrades really would be adding a secondary access point. So right now, people are entered into MAUSD based on an exchange through a camera with someone in the office. This would allow folks to come into the building into sort of a first entry point where they can have more of a direct contact with someone in the office through a transaction window. And then once there's a little more information about why the person's there and they've been sort of vetted by the person on the other side of the window, they would then be buzzed into the building. So it's a little added security for folks that are accessing the building during the school day when students are present. And of course, the bathrooms, for anyone that's used the bathrooms at MAUSD recently, I probably don't need to tell you much more than the fact that they need to be upgraded. They haven't really had a whole lot happen in the past 50 or so years since the building was constructed. So that's the big project that's kind of underway that'll get launched this spring. And we're going to have sort of a marketing campaign to talk more about what that looks like and offer some information. So that'll be coming out soon. In addition, we're building a plan to address the electrical system at MAUSD, which is in need. And there's an FAQ around that. You can see that on the website. And the roof needs to be replaced. The electrical system is well past the end of its life, and the roof is at the end of its life. So those are 2 pretty major capital improvements north of 1.5 million, we think, each, that are really important in the continued use of that facility. And again, there are a lot of decisions that need to be made by the community and by the board. So it's not 100% clear what the future holds, but we have to each year continue to think about that building and assume it's going to be used until we know otherwise. So electrical and roof, really practical, really important things to address. So that's the reasoning behind the 870,000. And our recommendation is to place the remaining balance, 549,000, into the education reserve. Education reserve is a flexible account that the board has authority to spend. And it's important to think about, and actually the next slide I think gets into the ed reserve a little bit deeper. I mentioned that we have these ESSER funds available to us that we can use through the end of next year and really just into the very beginning of the following, and that's great. And then those dollars are all gone, and there's no plan right now for dollars to come in that will replace those. So all the supports and services that we lean on to pay for with those dollars will go away. We then have this sort of period in time where we no longer have ESSER funds available, and we may not have landed at our more sustainable future place that we're trying to navigate right now. And so we have this gap that we need to bridge somehow between ESSER and our new sustainable future. It is anticipated that this education reserve fund could be used to bridge that gap. So putting money in this account becomes really important as a strategy to help navigate that. With a current balance of 550,000, adding that additional almost 550,000 gives us just shy of $1.1 million in that education reserve fund that the board has latitude to use to bridge that gap. Seems like a really important strategy as we project after next school year. And that really the idea is these positions that we're talking about in terms of supporting mental health, safety, and then other intensive needs, those are the kinds of things that we want to be able to help ensure we can sustain post-ESSER and into our more sustainable place. If I back up for a second, the capital reserve fund is a fund that money can only be spent out of that by a vote of the electorate, typically through a floor vote at annual meeting. What's going to happen at annual meetings a little up in the air right now with COVID, and we may learn more about what's going to be allowed or disallowed as a legislature engages in this session. So we don't know, but either way, those funds can only be spent by a vote of the electorate somehow. All right, so if we get into some of the details of the proposed budget for FY23, and again, this assumes there's $0 of fund balance used. My read of the last board meeting was that was the preferred. We could use some of the fund balance to offset taxes, but that means less money goes into either the capital reserve or the ed reserve. My read of the board at the last meeting was that there was more interest in using less fund balance. So what you're seeing tonight shows $0 in fund balance for next year. So with those assumptions, the budget would show a 2.8% increase, 2.87% increase in spending for next year. So that's overall spending compared to the current year. With that drop in equalized pupils, which again isn't as steep as we would have otherwise seen without the hold harmless, the increase in the cost per pupil is greater at 6.57%. What's important to note is what goes on the ballot are these two figures. It's going to show the overall cost or overall increase in expenditures at that percent, and it's going to show the overall increase in the cost per pupil, which would be the 6.57. And you can see that breakdown from our total expenses less our revenue gives us the ed spending. We divide that by the equalized pupil count that I talked about before, and that gives us our cost per equalized pupil. And we compare that to the current year to see what the change is. Another question was really, and this is a very important question, right? Decisions we make about next year's budget impact decisions that we make about the following year's budget. So thinking about next year in the context of years to come is good thinking and good planning. And so again, assuming $0 is used to offset taxes and all the assumptions that we just talked about, next year, FY23, if there was a spending threshold and the assumptions that we're making about spending thresholds come true, which assumes a 6.3% increase in threshold for next year, we feel pretty confident about that. And again, the threshold doesn't apply, but it is still kind of looming out there as a possibility for the future. So we still want to pay some attention to it. With this spending plan, we would be under the spending threshold, but just barely next year in FY23. If we made no changes to programming or personnel going forward, we would be over the following year by over $1 million. So we would have to figure out if we either wanted to reduce spending to get under that spending threshold or increase taxes to account for it. Those become the options. So that's sort of how this budget next year positions us into the future. Again, a lot of variables for 24, 25, and 26 that we can't predict very well right now. There's a lot of different ways they could go. But based on the assumptions that we've told you about tonight, this is where we think we would land for FY24. This is sort of another way to look at it. Looking at it in terms of the increase in the cost per equalized pupil. So historically, at least in recent years, the board has set a budget target that has said, keep us under the spending threshold because we don't want to pay a tax penalty. So we've used that as a budget target recently. In the absence of a spending threshold, we need a different target. So the target that has been set is usually around the cost per equalized pupil because that has the most direct impact on the tax rate. And so the figures that you're looking at tonight show that 6.57% increase in the cost per equalized pupil for FY23. And if we rolled all of that forward, assuming all of the things that we've talked about tonight, without making any other changes, that would mean an 8.2% increase to FY24, then 6.8, just under 6.4. So that's how this budget would position us from the perspective of cost per equalized pupil change. If we didn't use the 540,000, then next year's cost per equalized pupil isn't as high, but the increase in the following years remains about the same because again, we're rolling all those same personnel and programming forward. So we would still be looking at determining what to do with those percentages, either live with them as they are and we keep programming and personnel, or feel like they're too high and reduce programming and personnel. So another question that has come up is around ESSER funds and how do ESSER funds fit into this in terms of, and then in addition to the capital funds and the Ed Reserve funds. So the ESSER funds, again, they help pay for COVID related expenses, which can include personnel and it can include some capital expenses. But this really all has to be tied to COVID. So for capital expenses, looking at HVAC upgrades, sanitization, better seating, spacing, et cetera, those sorts of things are all sort of COVID related and become eligible. Personnel expenses likewise have to be connected to student loss of learning, student mental health and SEL needs, those sorts of things. Sort of, we have to tie it back to COVID needs. The capital reserve fund, as I mentioned, can only be used for capital improvements. That can't be used for personnel. It can really only be used for sort of construction services. And again, it needs voter approval. The education reserve fund, more flexibility, the board can use that, and we can use it for basically anything but capital expenses. So having this combination of a capital reserve and an education reserve positions the board really well to navigate some of the uncharted territory that we're going into. Each of these, and this is really important, each of these needs to be understood as one-time funds. One-time funds are great in many ways. The challenge with one-time funds is when you use them to lean on things like positions, when we can't sustain those positions without these one-time funds, when the funds go away, we feel that loss of those positions and that support. And so we have to be really careful and thoughtful about how we use one-time funds so that we don't position ourselves for hardship when, in particular, personnel go away when the funds go away. Doesn't mean we can't use them for them, and it doesn't mean we can't be strategic in how we use them, but we have to understand that really important factor of these one-time funds. There was another question about if we were trying to hit, in particular, a 5% increase in the cost per equalized pupil, would we need to RIF positions to get there? And the answer is no. We would not need to RIF positions to get to the 5% target that the board had originally set, and there wouldn't be any RIFs included, certainly in this 6.5% increase in the cost per pupil that we're talking about tonight. What we have been doing, and I mentioned this, is using that attrition as our friend, rather than having to make RIFs. Again, someone who's leaving for other reasons and not filling that position is a much easier thing to absorb than someone who wants to stay with us that doesn't get to. So we really look critically at that. And that's a strategy we can use going forward. You know, a lot of decisions have yet to be made in terms of what direction we're going in as a district for the future. And once those decisions are made and we have that direction, it is in our best interest to try and move in that direction as smoothly as possible by taking advantage of attrition as it presents. So we'll continue to look to use that to make as seamless a transition to wherever we're going as possible. And really the consequences of having these reductions in force really depend on what decision we make. You know, there are a lot of different options out there for us, and the options we choose have an impact on what will happen with a reduction in force. So a lot of fluidity, which is really hard, and that's our reality right now as we try to navigate this really challenging time. So really then, what does this boil down to in terms of the tax impact? This is where we all feel it, right? So this shows you what the tax rates are. And you start with this homestead tax rate. This is really the tax rate that our decisions in terms of spending and education drive. There's a lot of things that happen to the tax rate after this that are outside of our control. And that's unfortunate, but it's the reality. So looking at really the homestead tax rate and then the Act 46 adjustment, which is now gone. This is the first year we don't have a reduction for the merger work that we did. So you can see the adjusted homestead tax rate is now the same as the homestead tax rate. And again, as a merged district, this is equalized across all the towns. So what we can do to impact the tax rate has the same impact across all 5 towns in MAUSD. The common level of appraisal is where this starts to differ, right? Each town reassesses its homes at a different rate, and the value of homes in different towns can vary. And so this leads to different common levels of appraisal. These CLAs are now updated. I think the board saw some projected CLAs in the last presentation. Floyd can correct me if I'm wrong, but we've received information on CLAs, and this is now what we feel confident will be the CLAs used to influence the tax rate. Is that true, Floyd? I see you're nodding your head. Okay. So again, a lower CLA drives the tax rate up. A higher CLA either keeps it stable or can reduce the tax rate a bit. And that's what creates the variability in the education property tax rate that you see across towns. And really the question then is, so how does this really impact the wallet, right? So using those tax rates that you see on that previous slide, we're showing here the change from FY22 to FY23. And you can see it's a relatively modest change in most places. Starksboro, because of their CLA, the CLA in Starksboro took a bigger hit than others did. All CLAs took a hit. Starksboro's hit was bigger. So the change in the Starksboro tax rate was greater than what we saw in the other towns, pretty significantly greater. So the budget that you see tonight has this impact per $100,000 of assessed value for your home. So you can pretty easily do the math here based on what your home's assessed value is if you pay your taxes based on your home's value. What we know is about 2/3 of Vermonters do not pay their taxes based on their home's value. So this reflects about 1/3. The other 2/3 pay their taxes based on an income sensitized model. And so we have here for you at least an approximation. So the most recent median income for Addison County is 2019, and that's 68,825. So that's the median income. Using that median income, which again can vary for different households, but just to kind of show you where in the middle the impact would be, you can see the projected decrease is about $132. So for 2/3 of Vermonters using this median, they can expect a decrease in their tax rate. Floyd, is it fair to say that while the decrease may be different, everyone who pays based on income would see a decrease, or can you not say for sure?
Well, I think you can play out all the different scenarios as you go higher in the income and the different factors of home value versus income and how those impact each other. But I would say, generally speaking, I don't see it pushing an increase to most individuals.
Okay.
It's gonna be flat or a decrease. And taking this kind of middle of the road approach shows what we think.
Okay, thank you. So I want to transition now into some of the themes that came from the thought exchange, which there was a lot of information there, loads of comments. I read through them all. Trying to synthesize that and make sense of it was tricky. I think Krista, Nancy, there was a crew of people that did some initial synthesizing of that information, and I tried to synthesize what they synthesized to try and boil this down to making some connections to the budget. So what you see here reflects that. And so what I looked at were the top 100 ranked thoughts on the thought exchange by those themes that were put together by Krista and her team. And so the top themes that surfaced really were student support services, support for teachers, staffing, equity, inclusion, curricular programs, and safety. The numbers you see in parentheses show of the top 100 sort of themes that came out, that's how many times. So 25 of the top 100 ideas fell into that student support services theme. 18 of the top 100 fell into support for teachers, 14 under staffing. And again, there was some overlap, but this gives you a sense of kind of how they were rated within the thought exchange. And so I tried to pick these top themes to speak to and their connection to the budget. And so we'll kind of take one at a time. So the first one was the student support services. That's a pretty broad category. So within the student support services, some of the main ideas and concepts that were really showing up were around mental health supports, social, emotional, and behavioral supports, and family supports. And again, some overlap with each of these three. So connecting that to the budget, I wanted to articulate some of the ways that we are staffing or spending money that point back to supports in those areas. So the budget that you see for FY23 has 13 behavior assistants. And part of where this starts to get a little bit confusing is what's in the budget and then how many, and then what are we paying for through ESSER? So this asterisk means that 13 reflects mostly what we have in the budget, and some of these positions will be added and using ESSER funds to support them. There's also an SEL interventionist, there are SEL coaches, school-based clinicians, school psychologists, school social workers, counselors, mentor coordinators, SEL coordinator. All of these positions in various ways work to support these ideas and concepts that emerged under the theme of student support services. So I mentioned the behavior assistants. We are also targeting funds for social workers out of ESSER. Last year, MAUSD employed 1 school social worker. This year, we added 1 position with ESSER funds to try and help meet the increased need that we were seeing in families. That person was here for a brief time. We saw great feedback from that. People felt there was tremendous value in that added position. Unfortunately, that person left their position, and we're trying to fill it still, and there aren't applicants. But nevertheless, for the little time that we had, there was great benefit that was seen. So we want to keep the one that we've been employing through our budget, another one that we would fund through ESSER, and the plus sign that you see there reflects yet another one that would be paid for through that additional $540,000. Likewise with school counselors, most of those 8.2 we already employ in our budget, but there is money in ESSER for additional counselor time, and there's in that 540,000, there's more time budgeted for counselors. Moving on to support for teachers, which was the next theme. Some of the ideas and concepts that emerged were around training and SEL and trauma, but also in instruction, support around mental health, retention, salaries, planning time, etc. So I want to connect what you would see in the budget to those concepts. So MAUSD, along with most, maybe all schools, offers the Employee Assistance Program. Everyone I know that's accessed the EAP has spoken very highly of the quality of services there. So that's a resource. In terms of training and PD, in addition to coaches, which really offer embedded professional development, we have $244,000 available in PD funds for a range of workshops, conferences, college courses, etc. I mentioned the coaches, so 3 SEL coaches and 7 instructional coaches provide support for teachers in embedding that professional development. The great part about having coaches is they provide the professional development on early release days. They can then be in the classroom supporting teachers as they work to implement new strategies and kind of try things on. They can be a second set of eyes. They can model. There's a whole range of ways that coaches support teachers in growing in that professional development and instructional practices. It is also, I think, something to celebrate that MAUSD, through the work of negotiations in recent years, has emerged as, at least as of this year, I think there are negotiations underway, so hard to know where next year lands, but as of this year, we have the best pay scale in Addison County for professionals. That's to be celebrated. I think that is, it's much deserved, and it helps us attract and retain top quality candidates, which is very important. Planning time was another theme that emerged, or concept that emerged. MAUSD also has the most guaranteed prep time in the contract in Addison County. So we do have some things in our favor already built into the contract, reflected in the budget, that help provide that kind of support for teachers that emerged in those themes. The next theme was staffing, and some of the ideas that came out of there were an interest in keeping staffing levels high enough so teachers stay. Absolutely, retention is something that all schools are paying attention to. Really, recruitment and retention. Teacher staffing is a concern throughout the state, as is any staffing for any business around the state. I think we know there are more positions open right now in the state of Vermont than there are people to fill them. I think I heard a figure recently, somewhere around 20,000 open jobs right now and 8,000 people unemployed. So that creates a really difficult sort of job market, and education is not immune from that. Another theme that came out was an interest in reducing coaching and administrators, and an interest in hiring more teachers, assistants, counselors, and interventionists. So these ideas that emerged and what we see in the budget. So I think it's important to know that staffing by all accounts that I've seen, staffing in MAUSD is pretty similar to staffing in other Addison County districts and really in other Vermont districts. In some ways, we are better positioned. We have fewer unfilled positions in MAUSD than a lot of my counterparts that I'm talking with throughout the region. And it's also important to note that Vermont is known as having among the highest staffing levels per student in the country. Generally speaking, as a state, Vermont is very well staffed in education. What you see in FY23 does reflect fewer coaches. That was something that was raised. So there are 3.0 fewer coaches in FY23 than what was budgeted for FY22. I mentioned taking advantage of attrition. This is an area where we've taken advantage of attrition over the past budget cycle. Additionally, I talked before about a 0.1 reduction in administrators. Again, as we look forward to what the future holds for us, all of this is sort of subject to change. I really look forward to digging more into the work that Nate Levinson and the team at New Solutions K-12 or New K-12 Solutions is doing, and that can help us learn and make some adjustments as we go into FY24 and beyond. And it's important to note that really between ESSER and the budget, FY23 has 4.0 more assistants than FY22, 1.4 more counselors, 6.0 more interventionists, and we're still working on figuring out exactly the breakout of SEL, math, or literacy for those interventionists. But related to those themes, there are fewer coaches and fewer administrators, and there are more assistants, more counselors, and more interventionists. Equity and inclusion, some of the ideas were around students having the right to the same education, presumably regardless of what town they live in our 5 towns, access to resources and supports, and anti-racism, teaching tolerance were themes that emerged. So as we look at the budget, it's important to sort of reflect back on what has happened since we've merged, which really put us in a different position to look at equity across our schools. So since unification, we've really worked hard to create equitable experiences for students across schools. And some of the evidence of what we've done to create that equity is we now have common instructional blocks, which didn't exist before, common intervention blocks. Nearly all students receive their first instruction in their classroom. More students are receiving targeted intervention in their classroom with their classroom teacher as well. We have equitable access to interventionists and special educators for the intensive intervention support that students need. We have a common process for accessing those intensive supports. A little more work to do still at the 712 to fine tune that, but it's a much more equitable process. We have more comparable class sizes, and the access to professional development is much more common, and it's provided in service and early release days, aligned to the strategic plan, delivered primarily by coaches and coordinators. So a lot of work has happened to create that kind of equitable access to education and those supports. In terms of equity and in terms of the anti-racism and teaching tolerance, all schools have been engaged and will continue to be engaged in anti-racism and teaching tolerance activities. Now, the efforts vary across schools. Not everyone's not doing the exact same thing. But all schools are engaged in this work. Some examples are early release training around identity and racism. Those are things that have happened across the district. In addition, some schools are working with consultants. Mount Abe in particular comes to mind. In all schools, there are various student prompts and discussions happening around the topic. Book studies are happening in places. The Changing Perspectives curriculum is happening in more than one school. There are various units of study, affinity groups are being formed, there are artists in residence. Mount Abe, of course, raised the Black Lives Matter flag a while back. So these are all examples of some of the work happening across schools around anti-racism and teaching tolerance. These will evolve over time as sort of the baseline of understanding evolves. And over time, I think we can expect that we will sort of tighten this up a bit and do more sort of unified work across the district. In terms of curricular programs, interest in more co-curricular opportunities surfaced. desire for more variety in course offerings, presumably notably at Mount Aid, expanding the early education program, more hands-on learning, and more connection to the community. So when we think about how that connects to what you would see in the FY23 budget, there are funds in here to expand the co-curricular offerings. In particular, women's lacrosse, which is a collaborative with Virgins, has historically been hosted at Virgins. I think that the numbers of Mount Abe students are starting to outweigh pretty significantly the numbers of students from Virgins. So we're bringing that program in-house, and the costs surrounding that, given the higher numbers from Mount Abe, require some additional funds, and we are going to fund that. It's a highly successful program, still a pretty young program, and we want to see that grow. A lot of kids are very interested in that. We want to support that. Similarly, we're expanding some of the middle school athletics offerings, notably in lacrosse, starting a middle school lacrosse program. We haven't historically had one, but as our varsity program grows, we can start to grow the feeder program as well and sustain that in a way. We'll want to make sure that we're collaborating with other sort of community groups that are working with lacrosse to think about kind of a holistic approach, thinking about it from the student perspective, but nevertheless wanting to support that. Also looking at increasing opportunities in basketball, baseball, and soccer. Some of those things we're seeing really high numbers at and wanting to accommodate the numbers that we're seeing. Also really exciting, beyond athletics, we have other clubs that are growing in popularity, and we want to try to support that growth in a way that doesn't really take advantage of volunteers, et cetera. So there's money in this budget for increasing the support for rowing, for bass fishing, and for the environmental action group as examples. For example, the bass fishing team has a volunteer who uses their boat at tens of thousands of dollars in value in the boat. There's a significant investment in that person's time and resources to make bass fishing happen. And we want to make sure that we can support that person in continuing to offer this program, or make it something that would entice someone should there be a change in whoever that person is. So, and interestingly, this was news to me, bass fishing is a rapidly growing sport throughout the country. Colleges are starting to give scholarships for bass fishing, et cetera. And we happen to live next to one of the best bass fishing places in the country with Lake Champlain. So it makes sense to support this. It really offers support for kind of a niche group of students that may or may not otherwise participate in something else. So that's an example of the kind of thing that we want to continue to support. The expanding course offerings, that is certainly desired. I think there's mutual desire. The challenge of expanding course offerings in a small high school that's getting smaller is pretty significant. The reality is our declining student population and the declining ability to spend that comes along with that makes it very difficult to increase course offerings. So this budget does not reflect an increase in course offerings for next year. Hopefully we can find a path forward in this sort of more sustainable future that turns the tide on that a bit, and we can at least sustain, and if not improve and increase their course offerings at the secondary level. There's an interest in expanding the early ed or pre-K programming. We do have a saplings program that's relatively new still that is supported through FY23. The saplings program is work in collaboration with our early education program. And the saplings program is a childcare that supplements the 10 hours a week that families can access through our pre-K program. So that is something that's growing. It seems popular, and it's a great value and a great opportunity for parents to access. Additionally, the idea of expanding the pre-K programming is something we've explored. What we learned in that exploration with our pre-K coordinator that supports both Addison Central, Addison Northwest, and MAUSD is that if schools were to dramatically expand their pre-K programming from where we are, that has a pretty significant financial impact on our local private providers who are providing services to students in that age group. And that means that revenue would come away from those private providers, and the effect could be that we drive private providers out of business, which means the infant and toddler care that they also provide could go away. And that's where we see tremendous need right now, is in infant and toddler care. So we don't want to, with good intentions, expand pre-K, but have unintended consequences of reducing infant and toddler care. So we've intentionally not dramatically expanded pre-K for that reason, because we need to think more globally about the impact on our pre-K students, birth to through age 5, pre-K, in that bigger context, not just what we as a school could do with 3 and 4-year-olds or 5-year-olds. All right, curricular programs continued. So it is also important to note that ESSER funds do include money for STEAM. So science, technology, engineering, art, mathematics, a lot of hands-on. So this can be training, it can be resources, supplies, materials. So a lot of hands-on project-based learning embedded in that. We have a lot of work to figure out how to utilize those funds to try and provide those opportunities. But ESSER funds for next year are being targeted to be able to do that. And lastly, the budget does include funds for a community connection coordinator. It's a title I'm still kind of playing with a little bit, but I've been hearing a lot about a desire to strengthen the connection between schools and the community. That can happen in a variety of ways. A thought that comes to mind is, evening courses offered to families, other series of events. So having a person whose job it is to stay focused on that and create these opportunities and create that nexus between the community and schools, I think positions us well to grow that. So the budget does include a position for that purpose. And then lastly, safety. Students and staff need to feel safe. We need to have support for dysregulated students, and we really need to address bullying. Those were themes that came out of those were ideas that came out of the safety theme. And so a lot of overlap with that first slide in terms of the mental health, right? The safety and mental health supports and SEL supports do overlap quite a lot. And so again, the budget does have these staffing positions identified. What I would add here is a school safety coordinator. So what we're finding is the school safety coordinator would have a role in helping with Title IX investigations, which is a relatively new law change that is, I would say, significant in terms of the staffing that it needs and the time that needs to be dedicated to conduct those investigations well. So that's investigations into sexual harassment. But in addition, we need to be thinking about hazing, harassment, and bullying and supporting the work around those investigations. So those are two components of what the school safety coordinator would do. And beyond that, we need to really think about our more sort of broad approach to safety, thinking about crisis planning, et cetera. And that would be another role that the school safety coordinator would play. So there is money in the budget to add this position. What we've been doing for the recent years, we've been leaning on a teacher at the high school when they have time to fit in some of this work. This year, that high school teacher's schedule is busier than it was last year, so their time is unavailable. The reality is, leaning on someone to squeeze this work in when they get a chance is not a sustainable way to go, and it doesn't position us as well as we need to be positioned around student safety. So we need to dedicate someone's responsibilities to ensuring that our schools get the support they need to create the safe environments we all want. Okay, took a little longer than anticipated, but that was sort of an overview of the budget and its financial implications and the connection to some of the themes that emerged from the thought exchange. As Krista mentioned before, there were a number of questions that were submitted ahead of time, and those have all been answered, and they're on the FAQ doc that's on the website. And now if I can get my cursor to the right screen, I can stop sharing and we can shift to some Q&A. Here we go.
Thank you, Patrick. Okay, so there are a number of questions that have come in through the chat, which is great. And what I'm going to do is just read through them. And yeah, we'll answer them one by one. We're at also just doing a time check. We're at 8:06 and our end point is 8:30. So again, if you don't hear your question asked tonight, it will be added to the FAQ and that will be on the website. Okay, so the first question
is on the website too. I think
I'm sorry?
The presentation I just walked through is linked as well. So all those slides are accessible.
Great. Okay, thank you. Okay, so the first question, I don't understand the ideas of hold harmless or the weighted study and their relationship to the budget. So can you review those two concepts again, please?
Sure. Yeah, it takes time to understand these, and they've sort of been evolving. I think every board member would acknowledge the time it takes to understand what that means. So the hold harmless provision, and I'll let Floyd elaborate after I kind of set this up. The hold harmless provision was a mechanism that the state put in place to try and protect districts that would see a sharp decline in enrollment as a result of COVID. And so it was simply a protection for that reason. So that was a hold harmless. And the other part of that question, Krista, was?
The weighting study.
The weighting study. So I mentioned before that concept of equalized pupil. So we have the number of students that are enrolled in our schools. That's our enrollment, the number of kids that have signed up to come here, and they're the kids that are, ideally walking into school every single day. Each of those students has a different weight assigned to them based on their level of need. Students that are secondary students are weighted more heavily. Students that are on IEPs or 504s are weighted more heavily. Students that speak English as a second language are weighted more heavily. Students that qualify for free and reduced lunch are weighted more heavily. So there are all these different weights assigned to different needs of students. So essentially the formula is, at a really basic level, the number of students we have factored by their need gives us an equalized pupil. The weighting study is looking at changing that formula, changing those weights. Changing the weights changes the number of equalized pupils we have given our enrolled students. So the same number of enrolled students with different weights applied gives us a different equalized pupil count. And it's really that equalized pupil count that is the driving factor in our budget. It's the cost per equalized pupil that establishes the tax rate, that education tax rate, homestead education tax rate. So depending on decisions made around this weighting study, if the way the weights get changed increase our equalized pupils, even though we have the same number of enrolled students, then either we can spend more and get the same tax rate, or we can spend the same and get a lower tax rate. To the contrary, if the change in that formula, the change in those weights, decreases our equalized pupils, then we can spend the same and have a higher tax rate. So that's the impact that the weighting study has on the budget. Floyd, anything you'd want to add to either of those concepts?
No, I think that's the high level answer. I think the big piece with the hold harmless is just we had a lot of students who didn't come to school in our fiscal year 21 that would have built the next equalized pupils in the state. I think it was a wise move, didn't penalize districts for parents homeschooling, for example. and we're on the other side of that now. The issue for us and most districts in the state is declining enrollment has happened, and the hold harmless has hidden that effectively, because it's given us a number to work with that's inflated. Maybe I'm a little in the weeds now.
I'll move us on to the next question, but thank you both.
Thanks.
Okay, so the next question is the projected number of students in fiscal year 23 is an educated guess. Wouldn't it be more useful in these days of COVID disruptions to compare the change in the number of students from fiscal year 18 with the actual number of students in fiscal year 22?
I'm not fully sure I understand the question, but I think the way I understand it is, shouldn't we look at the rate of change from FY18 to FY22 and apply that rate of change from 22 to 23?
Yeah, I think that's how I read it as well.
Okay. And boy, the answer to that question, I would say, is no. I don't think that is necessarily the right approach to take, because that rate of change has been different each of those years. So I think we can predict with some reliability what enrollment for next year will be. Each year out that we project, it's less and less reliable, but being just, a number of months away, 8 or 9 months away from now, we can feel pretty confident what that number looks like. The bigger question is really the incoming kindergarten. But again, I think the figures that you see for FY23 are pretty reliable. They unlikely will be exact, but they'll be in the ballpark for what we need to be able to build next year.
Okay, thank you. The next question, the elevator at Mount Abe seems pretty dated. Is it safe and in working order for those who use it frequently, or is it in need of an update?
I know Floyd would love to elaborate on this. I'll try and tee it up for him. I think the short answer is, to say the elevator at Mount Abe is a little dated is quite an understatement. I would say the elevator at Mount Abe is definitely dated, and we have been looking at what to do with that. There are options to upgrade it as it sits, and those are somewhat limited. And there are options to replace it or add another one, and there are pros and cons to all of those. Floyd, I'll let you. Hopefully I teed it up enough for you, and you can take it from there.
Well, I think that's the umbrella to work under. Is it safe? I think that question needs to be answered, and we have it inspected. It is safe. Is it old? It is. Do we, as a district, need a new one? We probably should have a new one. Question is where to site it and how to have it work, and how to have it be accessible. And all of those things are in play currently in terms of trying to determine how we might be able to do it. And Patrick didn't say, we've talked with our architect and said, where could we find a spot inside? We could certainly build one on the outside. And is that the best solution? It's a solution, but having someone who is limited to only being able to change floors via an elevator, to have to go from one end of the building to get on the elevator that we've now built outside, ride the elevator, and then have to come all the way back to the other end of the building, doesn't seem like it's solving the problem. A lot going into this, and the thoughtful consideration to how do we fix this correctly and long term. We don't want a Band-Aid. We need to figure out how we can do this right. And we're getting numbers, and the construction industry around elevators is at least a year out, maybe even 14 months once you write them a check for the deposit. So all of those pieces lining up make it frustratingly slow for us, and probably for the questioner as well.
And I might elevate this conversation a little bit, right? The elevator, no pun intended, actually, but there should be pun there. That was a good one. The elevator is an example of an accessibility issue at Mount Abe. If I bring that a little further up, when we look to do work in schools, any project that we look at, we are looking not just to meet the bare bones standard for ADA. We're really trying to think about it from a universal accessibility perspective. So the elevator is one, right? We could keep the elevator as it is now and meet requirements and it functions, but it's not great. We could fix the elevator in its current size and make it work better, but have just the one elevator in that one location. If we really think about it from that universal accessibility perspective, fixing the elevator where it is now and making it proper and bright, etc., and adding another elevator is more in line with a universally accessible building. So that's kind of the thinking that we're applying to this project. That was applied to, say, the big front entry project at Robinson or the big front entry project at Bristol. Every time we have one of these upgrades, we try to think about it from a universal accessibility perspective, not just what's the least we have to do to meet ADA. You might also notice if you're in schools, a lot more push button accessibilities for the doors. Again, we don't have to have those, but those are a significant help in universal accessibility. So that's the elevator question and then some.
Okay, thank you. Okay, the next question. If we have about $1.4 million in excess funds, why would we reduce teachers in lieu of building improvements?
Yeah, so some of the reduction in staffing is keeping pace, and really all of the reduction in staffing next year is in keeping pace with the declining enrollment. If we didn't reduce a classroom position at Lincoln, for example, the class sizes in Lincoln would be significantly different than class sizes elsewhere. So that speaks a little bit to the staffing component. And the reality is, from a facilities perspective, for decades, and I think it's legitimate that it's decades, we have prioritized keeping staff over fixing buildings. And that's in part why we find ourselves, in particular at Mount Abe, in so much need of facilities upgrades. We're making tremendous improvements, like we are making gains. The building is in much better shape today than it was 5 years ago. And we have a long way to go still. And we need to continue to commit those funds to ensure that that building stays open. Case in point, right? We've all seen in the news in recent years, schools that didn't have the upkeep that they should have had, that developed problems with mold, et cetera. Some schools have had to close for many months, years even, because of some of those conditions. We would be in a pickle if Mount Abe couldn't be open because of not taking care of some of these needs. So investing in our facilities to keep them clean and safe and operable is critical in our continued function as a school district. So we can't not put money into these buildings again for decades to come.
Okay, thank you. This one is about some of the extra, you mentioned all of the extracurricular activities, and there was a question about whether we could expand the activities bus to run school year long to allow students access not only to after school activities, but also offerings in town.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely worth a look. I know it's probably a couple of years ago, Floyd, I don't even know if you were here. It might even be just prior to your time. I think there was an analysis done in terms of the use of the activities bus. Obviously, there's an expense in running activities buses. And there was an analysis done to see what the usage was. And I think the analysis showed that it was a pretty limited use, which to us indicated that that wasn't a barrier to student participation in athletics. We could do an analysis again and try to see how much of a barrier that is. And if it's a barrier, then it's worth the expense to make sure that it enables students to access our co-curricular programming. So again, it's been a little while. Maybe we're due to check that again, but that's why we do what we do now.
Okay, great. Thank you. Is there a plan for the budgeted added positions? Is there a plan if the budgeted added positions and the vacant positions due to retirement or resignation are not able to be filled? So these positions that we're talking about adding, what's the plan if they can't be filled? How will we meet the needs, stated and understood needs of the students in this scenario?
The plan will be to figure out a plan. The reality is we can't know today which positions we won't fill. So to plan a contingency plan for every position, right? So we're talking right now about filling positions that we're talking about adding. As I mentioned before, there's inevitably going to be attrition this year. If we forget about positions we're adding, there's concern about being able to fill positions that become vacated through attrition. So being able to fill positions as a general concept is a concern going forward. Again, not just for MAUSD, that's a concern for every school district in the state of Vermont. And the plan depends on which position and in reality, which combination of positions we can or cannot fill. So we have to do this on a regular basis throughout the school year. As you know, if a new student moves in who has needs that require us to hire additional personnel than what we expected, and we post for that, and we can't get someone to fill it, oftentimes this might be a student on an IEP, and we are legally obligated to provide those services. So we have to come up with a plan to shift staffing internally to meet those needs. And that means those staff aren't doing whatever it is they were assigned to do before. So that constant shifting and kind of working with the information we have is something we do throughout the year. And it's something we would have to do if we find we can't fill positions that we're trying to fill. And I'm concerned that it will be more of a problem going forward than it has been a problem in our past.
Okay, thank you. We have two more questions. Is the school district or are our 5 towns conducting a child-by-child annual count of 0 to 5-year-olds? If not, why not? And if so, are we using those numbers to refine our enrollment projections?
Yeah, so the work of the NESDEC, so the New England School Development Corporation, that's an organization that we've partnered with. A lot of school districts in Vermont partner with them. We hired them to conduct our enrollment study, and they provided us some great information. We now are subscribers, I guess. Like we pay an annual fee to be a member. Yeah, a member. Thank you, Floyd. With NESDEC. So we get really twice a year, we get enrollment updates that we use to anticipate going forward. And we kind of work with those enrollment updates, and we look at the local context and work with that to get a sense. So part of the work NESDEC does is looking at births and all of that information to help make accurate projections going forward for the district.
And on top of that, when we're looking at our projections, we're looking at birth rates 4 years ago, 3 years ago. I don't think 2 years we can get our hands on it yet. But it's information the state has that we're plugging in to get some sort of a best guess what our kindergarten is going to look like.
And I think if there's something to celebrate in terms of enrollment, it is that it seems as though the enrollment at the elementary level is beginning to plateau. I don't know that we can say it's necessarily plateaued, but it's starting to plateau. The incoming kindergarten classes are starting to kind of level out. We do, as I mentioned before, we do still have the decline we've seen in recent years in elementary schools has to work its way through the high school. So we're still going to feel that effect. Over the next 10 years, the trend is we will lose more students. I think the projection is around 150 students over the next 10 years, which uses birth rates as part of the projection. And then it seems like hopefully we will begin to stabilize. Hard to know 10 years from now what variables will be thrown our way, but that's what the forecast looks like.
Okay, great. All right. And are there ways in which the budgeting for next year and longer term is designed to ensure that each town's elementary school can stay open?
Yeah, I mean, so the budget for FY23 specifically doesn't really reflect any big change to keep schools open, except that it staffs schools and it essentially maintains what we have now, and in many cases will actually increase staffing over what we have now across schools. So everything about FY23 keeps schools open and keeps them running. Again, thinking about the work that Nate Levinson and the team at New K-12 Solutions is doing, that's helping us to think about ways forward, which can include keeping schools open and what it would need to look like to keep schools open, and might include repurposing or closing schools. And the board's going to have to weigh all the pros and cons and the variables and the information that Nate and his team puts forth and figure out what makes sense going forward. So FY23 is really just about FY23. And the other work and other decisions are really about the longer range planning for schools.
Great, thank you. Just on that note, I wanted to let this group of folks know that we will be hearing a presentation from Nate Levinson and his team on his report on January 25th. I believe it's at 6 o'clock, but it will be posted to the school board calendar. So I think it should be very informative and encourage folks to attend. I'm just going to, that was our last question, and I'm just going to share my screen for a second so that folks can see where you can access the FAQ from this meeting. And that also includes questions that board members asked prior to tonight and the answers. And then also just sharing the email of our board chair, Don Griswold. And if you have other questions that come up after this meeting that you'd like to have answered regarding the budget, you can send Don an email. And if you would just put in the subject line budget question, that will make sure that it gets to the top of her inbox. So I think that's all we have for you this evening. And again, we really appreciate everyone coming. Thank you, Patrick, for your presentation, and Floyd for chiming in. And we hope that you found it useful. And I think that's all we have for you this evening. So thanks, everyone. Have a great evening.